Hello everyone. Before we start our sleepy journey, like the video and subscribe to the Store a Sleeper. This is the story of Rip Van Winkle, written by Washington Irving. Now, lean back, settle your thoughts, and allow yourself to drift into a world of long ago. The following tale was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman from New York, curious in the Dutch history of the province, and especially fond of the manners of the descendants of its original settlers. Though his historical research lay not among books, he searched for history among people. Old burghers, their wives, their stories were his treasure. So it was that he came to compile a history of New York under Dutch rule. A curious work, not the finest in prose, but praised for its accuracy. And now, beloved by biscuit bakers and historians alike. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. Those noble heights, blue and purple by day, and crowned with fire in the rays of the setting sun. To the good folk of the region, these mountains are no ordinary hills. They are barometers of mood and magic. Their shadows long, their outlines noble. At the foot of these enchanted hills lies a quiet village. A small place, nestled in trees and shingled roofs. Settled long ago by Dutch colonists. In the time of Governor Peter Stuyvesant. May he rest in peace. Some of the homes still stand. Made of yellow bricks brought from Holland. With gabled fronts, latticed windows, and weathercocks that spin like stories in the wind. In one of those humble houses lived a man, a good-natured soul by the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a simple fellow, gentle, helpful, kind to children, and thoroughly henpecked by his wife. Yes, Dame Van Winkle. A sharp tongue and an iron will. She was the weather of his life, and rarely a sunny day. But Rip was beloved. The village wives sided with him in every squabble. The children adored him, clinging to his coat and following him through town, while he crafted toys, told ghost stories, and taught them to fly kites. Even the dogs did not bark at Rip. But Rip had one great flaw. He had an aversion. No, a deep-rooted allergy to profitable labor. He would happily fish for hours, even if nothing bit. He'd wander through woods for the chance of spotting a squirrel. He was the first to help a neighbor, but the last to help himself. His farm? A mess. The fences crumbled. The cow got into the cabbage. The weeds outgrew the crops. And Rip would throw up his hands and say, "It's no use. The land itself is cursed." Meanwhile, his children grew wild and ragged. Especially little Rip, his son, trailing after his mother in oversized breeches that barely stayed up. Rip Van Winkle was one of those happy mortals who take the world easy. Eat white bread or brown, whichever comes easier. and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left alone, he would have whistled life away in perfect peace. But his wife never ceased her scolding. Morning, noon, and night. Her voice echoed through the house. And everything Rip did, or didn't do, was met with a storm of blame. He had only one reply to it all. A shrug. A sigh. A glance to the sky. And silence. Which, of course, only made matters worse. So Rip would retreat to the only part of the house that was his. The outside. Rip's only companion was his dog, Wolf, who was just as henpecked as his master. Whenever they entered the house, Wolf's tail would drop. His ears would flatten, and he'd creep through the kitchen like a thief. At the slightest raise of a ladle, Wolf would flee to the door, yelping as he went. As the years passed, things grew no better. Rip's refuge became the bench outside the inn, where the sages of the village gathered beneath a sign of King George III. There, in the shade, they talked of nothing all day long. Village gossip, old tales, and, now and then, when a newspaper arrived, they debated national matters months after they'd occurred. Their leader was Nicholas Vedder, an elder who said very little, but whose opinions were known by the speed of his pipe. When pleased, he puffed slowly and serenely. When displeased, he puffed short and angry. And thus, the council understood the world. But even this peace was not safe, for Dame Van Winkle would appear without warning, shattering the quiet with a storm of fury, and dragging Rip home before the assembly. Poor Rip was left with only one place of solace: the woods. There, beneath the trees, he would sit with Wolf, sharing bread from his pocket, looking at the sky. Poor Wolf, he would say, thy mistress leads thee a dog's life. But don't worry. While I live, you'll never want for a friend. Wolf would wag his tail, look into his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, then surely he did. One autumn afternoon, Rip wandered farther than usual. He climbed high into the Catskill Mountains, his gun slung over his shoulder, looking for squirrels, but mostly for peace. Late in the day, tired and panting, he sat on a soft green hilltop, looking down over the forest below. He could see the Hudson River, far off, glimmering like glass. He could see the clouds drifting, and hear the birds calling across the valley. He sighed. He would be late getting home, and Dame Van Winkle's wrath would be fierce. Then, he heard it. A voice, far off, calling, Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle. He turned. Nothing. Again, the voice came. Rip Van Winkle. Wolf growled. Rip looked down into the glen, and there, climbing the rocks, was a short, stout man, struggling beneath a keg. His clothes were odd, old-fashioned, like something from a painting. A jerkin at the waist, breeches with rows of buttons, a long, grizzled beard. He motioned for Rip to help him. Though wary, Rip was helpful by nature. He took one side of the keg, and they climbed on together, up a dry, rocky gully that wound through the cliffs. Now and then, Rip heard what sounded like thunder. Long rolling peals, deep and distant. At last they reached a hidden hollow, a bowl in the mountains, ringed by cliffs. And in the center, a group of strange figures. They were playing ninepins, but not a sound passed their lips. They dressed like ancient Dutchmen, with beards and hats and swords, and all wore somber expressions, as though mourning at a game. Rip stood frozen. The man with the keg poured the liquor into great flagons, and motioned for Rip to serve the players. He did. The men drank in silence, then resumed their game. Rip, confused but curious, tasted the drink. Holland's gin, strong and smooth. He drank again, and again, and again, until the mountain spun. His head nodded low, and Rip Van Winkle fell into a deep sleep. Rip Van Winkle awoke. He was lying on the green knoll, where he had first seen the strange old man with the keg. The sun was shining. The sky was bright and blue. Birds chirped above in the branches, and far overhead, an eagle soared, riding the mountain breeze. Rip sat up slowly. Surely, he murmured, I haven't slept here all night. He rubbed his eyes. He stretched his limbs. He tried to remember. The keg, the ninepins, the strange, silent men in old Dutch clothes, the drink. Oh, that flagon, he whispered. That wicked flagon. He reached for his gun, but instead of his clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old rusted musket, the lock falling off. Its stock worm-eaten, the barrel red with rust. What is this? He looked around for Wolf. No sign of the dog. He whistled. He called out, but no bark came in return. Only the echoes answered. Rip felt a chill in his chest. Had he been robbed? Had he been tricked? He stood slowly, his joints stiff, his legs aching as though they belonged to someone older. These mountain beds, he muttered, don't agree with me. He stumbled down into the glen, following the path he had climbed the day before. Or had it been the day before? He found the same narrow gully, but now, instead of dry stone, a mountain stream gushed down its path. Water tumbled from rock to rock, foaming and cold. Still, Rip scrambled up, through thickets and vines, pushing past birch and sassafras and hazel, all tangled by wild grapevines that curled like ropes in the trees. He reached the place where the hidden hollow had opened, the amphitheater of the ninepin players. But it was gone. Where once had been an opening, now stood a solid wall of rock. The waterfall poured over the cliff, crashing into a deep black pool, shadowed by the forest. Rip stood in silence. He called again for Wolf. He waited. He listened. Only the cawing of distant crows answered. High above, circling the cliffs, Rip lowered his head. His stomach grumbled. He was cold, and hungry, and confused. So, with heavy steps and a heavier heart, he turned toward home. As he neared the village, he began to notice something strange. The people. They were unfamiliar. Their clothing was different. Their faces strange. And yet, the landscape was the same. He thought he knew everyone in the region, but none returned his smile with recognition. And worse, they stared at him. They pointed. Some laughed. Children ran after him, giggling and pointing at his beard. Rip, confused, reached up to his chin. His fingers touched hair. Long hair. A beard, a full foot in length, now flowed from his face. What in heaven's name? He stepped into the village proper, and his heart sank. The buildings were new, larger, taller. Shops bore strange names. Faces in windows were unfamiliar. The town he knew, had changed. He walked to the place where his home had stood. The roof had collapsed. The windows shattered. The doors hung loose from rusted hinges. A half-starved dog skulked nearby. Wolf, he called. The dog growled, bared its teeth, and slunk away. My very dog, he whispered Rip, has forgotten me. He stepped into the house. It was empty, dark, abandoned. No warmth, no voices, no life. He called aloud for his wife, for his children, but the house echoed back only silence. He stumbled back out and hurried to the village inn. Surely someone there would know him. But the old inn was gone. In its place stood a tall, worn building, wooden and rickety, with wide broken windows patched by rags and old clothes. A sign hung above the door, "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Where once had stood a great old tree shading the porch, there now rose a tall pole, naked and bare, with a red cap atop it and a flag flapping in the breeze. Stripes and stars. A flag Rip had never seen before. He looked again at the inn sign. The ruby face of King George, once painted proudly, was now dressed in blue and buff, a sword in his hand, a cocked hat on his head. Below it, General Washington. Rip stood motionless. Around him, a crowd began to gather. Men speaking fast, arguing, debating. Voices loud and quick. Words flew past him. Rights of citizens. Elections. Congress. Liberty. Bunker Hill. 7 to 6. None of it made sense. He searched for familiar faces. For Nicholas Vedder, with his long pipe. For Van Bummel, the schoolmaster. But they were gone. Instead, a tall, severe man with a cocked hat marched up to Rip and barked. "Which side do you vote for?" Rip stared blankly. "Vote?" Another man tugged his sleeve. "Are you federal or Democrat?" I, Rip stammered. A hush fell. Another man stepped forward. Sharp eyes, sharp chin, sharp voice. He pointed a finger at Rip. "What brings you here with a gun on your shoulder and a mob at your heels? Are you come to stir up a riot?" Rip shook his head. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am a quiet man, a native of this place, a loyal subject of the king, God bless him." Gasps. Then, an uproar. A Tory, as someone cried. A spy. A refugee. Seize him. Hands grabbed at him. Voices rose in anger. The man in the cocked had raised his cane to restore order. "Enough," he said sternly. "Stranger, who are you looking for?" Rip, breathless, answered, "I came only to see my friends." "Where is Nicholas Vedder?" A thin, cracked voice answered from the crowd. "Dead these 18 years. The tombstone crumbled long ago." Rip's heart trembled. Bram Dutcher went off to the war. Killed at Stony Point, or maybe drowned. Never came back. Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, off to war as well. Now a general in Congress. Rip's eyes blurred. His hands trembled. He cried out, "Does no one here know Rip Van Winkle?" Voices murmured. Then one called, "Oh, Rip Van Winkle? That's him, over there, by the tree." Rip turned and saw himself, or rather, a young man, his mirror image, leaning lazily against a tree, clothes torn, hat in hand. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He staggered. The man in the cocked hat snapped, "What is your name?" I don't know," a Rip whispered. "I was myself last night, but now I'm someone else. That's me, or it was. I slept in the mountains, and something's changed. Everything is changed. The crowd whispered. They tapped their foreheads. They spoke of madness. Then, a young woman pushed through the crowd. A child in her arms. Soft cheeks. Curious eyes. The child wailed at the sight of Rip's beard. "Hush, Rip," the woman said gently. "The old man won't hurt you." Rip's heart thudded. He stared at her face. The voice. The eyes. The name she'd spoken. "What is your name, my good woman?" he asked. "Judith Gardenier." "And are your father?" She sighed. "Rip Van Winkle. But he disappeared 20 years ago. Went into the mountains with his gun. And never came home. His dog came back alone. We don't know what happened to him." Rip's lips trembled. "Where is your mother?" he asked softly. "She died not long ago," Judith answered. "Burst a blood vessel, arguing with a peddler." Rip felt the world shift once more. He stepped forward. Tears in his eyes. "I am your father," he said. "Rip Van Winkle, or once young, now old." He wrapped his arms around her. And she did not pull away. The crowd fell silent. An old woman stepped forward, squinting at him. She peered into his eyes and whispered, "It is Rip Van Winkle. It is him. Welcome home, old neighbor. Where have you been these 20 years?" Rip's story was soon told. And for him, those 20 years were but one long night. Some shook their heads. Some rolled their eyes. But one man was summoned. Old Peter Vanderdonk, the village's oldest resident. He stepped forward. He listened. And he nodded. He had heard such tales before. He spoke of Hendrik Hudson and his ghostly crew, said to appear in the Catskills every 20 years, playing ninepins in the hollows, guarding the river and the land. He had heard their thunder himself. He said, on summer afternoons. And thus, Rip Van Winkle returned. He went to live with his daughter. Her home was warm. Her husband, one of the boys who had once played on Rip's back, was kind. His son, now grown, worked the farm. Though he, too, had inherited his father's gift for doing very little. Rip resumed his old ways. He sat once more outside the inn, now called the Union Hotel, and told his story to every stranger who came through town. At first, the tale changed with every telling, but in time, it settled. Everyone in the village knew it by heart. Some called him mad, but the old Dutch folk believed him. And even now, when thunder rolls over the Catskills, they say Hendrik Hudson and his men are playing ninepins again. And the hen-pecked husbands of the valley? Well, They all wish for just one draught. From Rip Van Winkle's Enchanted Flagon. The tale of Rip Van Winkle had been told, but the writer, Diedrich Knickerbocker, felt the need to add one final word, a note to the curious. He wrote, "The story of Rip Van Winkle may seem incredible to many, but nevertheless, I give it my full belief. For I know the vicinity of our old Dutch settlements to be filled with marvelous events and appearances. I have heard many stranger tales along the Hudson River, all of which were too well authenticated to doubt. In fact, I have even spoken to Rip Van Winkle myself. When I last saw him, he was an old man, perfectly rational and clear, on every subject but this one, and I have seen a certificate on the matter, signed by a country justice, in his own handwriting. Therefore, I must say, the story is beyond doubt. DK. And so ends the tale. But the mountains, they remain. And if you ever visit the Catskills, look carefully, listen closely. You may hear more than just the wind in the trees. For the Catskill Mountains have long been a place of legend, a land of spirits, of echoes, of forgotten watchers in the clouds. The native peoples once believed the mountains were home to a powerful spirit, a mother figure, an old squaw, who ruled over weather and season. She was said to live on the highest peak, opening the doors of day and night with each rising sun. She hung the new moons in the sky and cut the old ones into stars. And when properly pleased, she spun soft clouds from cobwebs and dew, floating them out across the valley, until they burst in gentle summer rain. But when angered, she brewed storms black as ink, sitting at the center of her cloud, like a fat spider in her web. And when that storm broke, the valley trembled. There are other legends, too, of a trickster spirit, a manatee, dwelling in the wildest reaches of the mountains, taking the form of a bear, a panther, a deer, leading hunters on hopeless chases through tangled rocks and trees, only to vanish at the edge of a cliff with a booming laugh. The most sacred place, they say, was a spot called Garden Rock, covered in flowering vines, hidden among the peaks. A lake lies nearby, still, quiet, haunted by herons and snakes that glide across the lily leaves. And once, only once, a hunter lost in the woods found that secret garden. He took a gourd from the crook of a tree, but as he fled, he dropped it on the rocks. And from that broken gourd sprang a stream of water, rushing, raging, sweeping the hunter down the cliffs. His body was never found, but the stream flowed on, down the mountain, into the valley, and still runs today. They call it the Catskill. And now, as twilight falls across the Catskills, and thunder rolls down from the peaks. The people of the valley still pours, still listen, and still wonder, is that just thunder? Or are Hendrik Hudson and his ghostly crew rolling ninepins once again? A long time ago, in a place that had no light, the sun ruled the sky. She would rise from the sea every morning and give her light to the world. But when she returned to the ocean, darkness would fall. No one could see, no one could travel, and the fisherman's daughter, who lived in a village by the sea, missed her father dearly. He would leave before sunrise to fish, and return only when the sun rose again. Every night, she would wait. She would listen to the wind. She would whisper to the sea, and she would dream of her father, lost in the darkness somewhere beyond the waves. One evening, as the sky began to darken, the fisherman's daughter climbed the tallest hill near the sea. She wanted to watch the sun sink into the water. She wanted to say goodbye, and she wanted to ask a question. When the sky turned gold, and the sea shimmered like fire, the sun appeared above the waves. She rose slowly, casting long shadows over the hills and fields. And when she saw the fisherman's daughter, she paused. "You are always waiting," said the sun. "What is it you wish to ask me?" The girl took a deep breath. "Please, great sun," she said, "will you give me a piece of your light, so I can guide my father home at night?" The sun looked down kindly. "But I must light the whole world," she said. "If I give you my light, how will others see? How will the day begin? The girl looked down. She did not want to take the sun away from others. She only wanted to help her father. And so, she nodded. I understand. But the sun had seen her sadness. She had heard the girl's quiet voice, night after night. So the sun whispered something very old, something even older than the ocean. And then she said, take this and hold it tight. You will know what to do when the time is right. The fisherman's daughter looked into her hands. There was nothing there. And yet, she felt something warm, like the memory of sunlight on her face. She looked up, but the sun was gone, and the stars had not come yet. That night, the fisherman's daughter could not sleep. She sat on the shore, watching the waves roll in and out. She held her hands close to her heart, remembering the warmth the sun had given her. She still couldn't see anything in her palm, but she felt it, a light waiting to awaken. And then, just as the sky turned its deepest shade of blue, she saw something, a small glow, flickering, far above the sea. Then another, and another, soft points of light, tiny and scattered, beginning to appear in the sky. The girl stood in wonder. They were small at first, but then the lights grew clearer, brighter, gentler. They danced like fireflies and shimmered like lanterns across the heavens. The girl reached up, and this time, her hand caught one. It was as if she had touched the very breath of the sun, a tiny drop of golden warmth, floating in the night. From that moment, she knew what to do. She climbed the hill again, and there, under the dark dome of sky, she began placing the lights where they belonged. One by one, she set them in the sky, little bursts of brightness, each guiding a different path. Some she scattered like sand, sprinkled far and wide. Others she placed in careful patterns, lines and shapes and clusters that would tell stories to the night. She gave each light a purpose. One would guide fishermen, one would guide travelers, one would lead lost children home. And when she had finished, the sky was no longer dark. It was full of stars. The people of the village awoke to find the sky transformed. They stepped outside and looked up, and they gasped. The night was no longer something to fear. Now it shimmered. Now it spoke. And the fisherman? He looked up from his boat, far out at sea, and for the first time, he saw a trail of light across the water. He followed it, past quiet waves and sleepy fish, all the way to the shore, where his daughter waited. He gathered her in his arms, and the stars go a little brighter. From that day on, the fisherman was never lost at sea, nor was any sailor, or traveler, or wanderer beneath the sky. The stars watched over them, guided them, carried their hopes across the night, and all who looked up could see the care placed in each glowing point. A daughter's love, a gift from the sun, a map written in light. The stars told stories. They whispered names. They marked time and tides and seasons. They reminded people that even in darkness, there is beauty. There is guidance. There is light. And though the fisherman's daughter grew old, the stars remained. They stayed where she placed them, tucked into the deep velvet of the night. Her hands, once small and unsure, had shaped the sky. And so today, when the world grows still, and night folds itself over the sea, we look up. We see the stars. We wonder where they came from. And somewhere, in the hush between moon and wave, we remember a girl, a daughter who waited, who listened, who asked a question, and lit the sky for all of us. Bunyan was a lumberjack. He wore a red and black checkered shirt and a checkered logging cap to match, and his blue jeans were held up with bright yellow suspenders. On his feet he wore heavy work boots, and in his hand he always carried an axe. There are more stories about Paul Bunyan than there are stars in the sky, but the one thing they all have in common is that they tell how Paul was the biggest and best lumberjack that ever lived. When America was a young country, logging was an important business. The land was covered with dense forests of pine and spruce and mahogany and oak. It was a growing country, and the land had to be cleared to make way for farms and towns. Lumber was needed to build ships, houses, stores, and courthouses. That is where Paul Bunyan came in. Most folks think Paul was born in Maine, close to the Canadian border. Although no one seems to know exactly where Paul was born, or when, everyone does agree about one thing. He was a big baby. It is said that at birth, Paul weighed 8 to 6 pounds, give or take a few, and he grew even bigger mighty quickly. Folks in Maine say that whenever Paul rolled over in his cradle, the whole neighborhood shook and the neighbors got worried. That's because if Paul rolled around too much, he could knock over all of the trees for miles around. His poor mother hardly knew how to keep Paul fed. Why, in a single day her son would eat 74 buckets of oatmeal with 5 gallons of maple syrup on them and then drink 14 gallons of milk. Keeping him in clothes was an even bigger problem, for he grew so fast in all directions. At first, Paul's father made him a new pair of boots every day, but at last, he gave up. Paul was just going to have to walk around barefoot until he finally stopped growing. One day Paul did stop growing. Everyone was relieved, because by that time, Paul was as tall as the tallest pine tree. Now you might think that is stretching the truth, but there is no doubt Paul was a mighty big fellow. You see, most folks only came up to Paul's ankles. Now that Paul was full grown, he decided it was time for him to make his own way in the world. Paul's mother and father were sad to see him go, but secretly his mother couldn't help feeling a little relieved, as she told her husband, keeping our boy fed was becoming an impossible chore. So they climbed a great big ladder and kissed Paul goodbye. Then his father gave him a new pair of gigantic boots, and off Paul went. Soon he came to a logging camp. Although Paul had no experience with logging, he talked the camp foreman into letting him try it out. With one great cry of a timber, he swung his axe across 20 trees, bringing them all down in a single blow. The foreman's mouth dropped wide open, and he hired Paul right there on the spot. Now, just about every other logger in the world would have been overjoyed to cut trees that fast, but not Paul. He was sad that he couldn't cut them down even faster. He puzzled over this until he came up with a solution to his problem. His problem was his axe. Being as big as he was, Paul didn't use an ordinary axe. No, his axe had a head as big as a cow, and a handle that had been carved out of an entire tree. It worked pretty well at first, but when Paul really got it swinging, he had a bad habit of breaking the handle. He sure went through an awful lot of axe handles, until the day he decided to design himself a new axe altogether. First, he got a 50-yard piece of rope. Then, he took the axe head off of his old axe and tied it to the end of the rope. When the other loggers saw Paul's axe, they almost died of laughing. But their laughter didn't bother Paul. Gripping the rope tightly in his hands, Paul whirled the axe around him. The other loggers watched in amazement as Paul made 40 trees fall to the ground in a single whirl of the rope. Paul didn't stay at the logging camp for long. If he had, there would have been no more trees for the other loggers to cut down, and they depended on their work so that their families wouldn't starve. So Paul decided to strike out on his own. He traveled far and wide, harvesting lumber as he headed towards the nearest sawmill. Then came the famous winter of the blue snows. The weather was mighty unusual that year. Day after day, thick blue snow fell from the sky until the land, rooftops, and even the treetops were covered in blue. It got colder and colder too, so cold that eventually nobody dared to go outside. Nobody, that is, except for Paul. Bunyan. On one of those cold blue days, Paul took off into the woods, whistling to himself, to keep his mind off the cold. The trees sure looked beautiful with all that blue snow around them. Paul was busy looking around when all of a sudden he tripped over something, which he often did because his feet were so far below his eyes. He looked down, and there, to his amazement, he saw a pair of hairy blue ears sticking out of the snow. Paul scratched his chin. Then he reached down and grabbed an ear in each hand. He pulled as hard as he could, and out of the snow popped a big, baby blue ox. The ox looked awfully cold, so Paul carried it back to his cabin. Once inside, he set the shivering ox down by the fire. All night long, Paul nursed the poor baby ox. When morning came, the young animal stood up, leaned over, and licked Paul on their cheek with her big, rough, blue tongue. The licking tickled, and Paul burst out laughing. "Babe," he said, patting the ox's neck, "yeah, I got a feeling you and I are going to be great friends." And that was how the blue ox got her name. Paul was happier than he had ever been. Now he had a partner to help him with his logging. He'd cut down the trees, and Babe, the mighty blue ox, would haul them to the river where they floated to the sawmill. Like his master, Babe grew up to an enormous size. No one knows for sure how much Babe weighed, but it's said that their distance between her eyes measured exactly 140 axe handles, 3 jugs of maple syrup, and a large sack of oatmeal all laid end to end. Babe and Paul were wonderful friends, and Paul felt that, together, there was nothing they couldn't do. But, although Paul and Babe were the best logging team you could find, it was sometimes hard for them to find work. That's because no logging company could afford to keep the two of them fed. Why, on just one average working day, Paul would have 5 bushels of fried potatoes for dinner, 45 pounds of beefsteak, 7 or 8 hams, 16 loaves of bread, 13 dozen eggs, and to finish it all off, 678 pancakes topped with 9 gallons of maple syrup. Paul would then wash all of it down with 10 gallons of black coffee. So you can see why Paul and Babe weren't too popular around the logging camp cooks. So Paul decided to start a logging camp of his very own. Paul's first logging camp was on the Onion River in the northern woods of Minnesota. He hired several hundred lumberjacks. Paul wanted this to be the biggest and best logging camp ever. And it was. Old loggers who worked at Paul's camp claim it was so big that the men needed maps and compasses just to find their way around. Some folks say he dug the Great Lakes to supply the camp with water. The cookhouse alone covered for square miles. The food was carried to the dining room by means of horse-drawn wagons, and there was a pipeline that brought warm maple syrup to each table. I've heard on good authority that the food in Paul's camp was mighty good. Sourdough Sam, the camp cook, made a mean venison stew and some delightful fried chicken. But Sam's sourdough pancakes were every logger's all-time favorite. In fact, Sam was the world expert when it came to making pancakes, and sourdough pancakes were his own invention. They say Paul drained a small lake to give Sam enough room to mix their batter. And the griddle was so big that the kitchen staff had to tie great slabs of bacon to their feet and skate across it just to keep it greased. After a while, Paul grew tired and restless. There were forests in parts of their United States that he had never been to before. So he decided to make his logging camp a traveling logging camp. The very next day, Paul and his loggers set out westward across the United States. While traveling, they logged in the Dakotas, Oregon, Washington, and just about everywhere else in between. Now, all of this tree cutting might sound like it was unhealthy for the land, but Paul didn't do any harm. Although he cut down millions of trees, he made sure he replaced each one with a new seedling. He did this because, as a boy, he had learned that in order for a forest to flourish and grow, it needed to be treated with respect. Whenever a new job came, Paul and his men would move the whole camp to it. This was easy. They'd simply place great big wheels under the dining room, cookhouse, and all of the loggers' bunkhouses. Then Paul would link them all together with log chains and hook them to Babe's harness. The mighty ox would go to work pulling the entire camp behind her as if it were as light as a goose feather pillow. One time Paul and his men were logging in Wisconsin. They had to use a road that was so crooked and tangled up that they couldn't even find their way to the forest. The road was such a mess that loggers going back to camp would run right smack into themselves coming the other way. Paul knew that something had to be done. He considered the problem for a while, and then the answer came to him. He simply hitched Babe, the mighty blue ox, to the road and yelled, "Come on, Babe! Pull! Pull!" Babe grunted and groaned and yanked as hard as she could. For a while, nothing happened. Then, with a loud crack, so loud that it sounded as if the earth was splitting in two, the crooked road lost all of its kinks and became as straight as a ruler. Paul loved solving tricky problems like that. In fact, problem solving was one of his favorite activities. Of course, one thing leads to another, and all of this problem solving eventually led to some inventions. Paul was the man who invented the chainsaw, the double-headed axe, and all the other tools that loggers use today. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Paul's many accomplishments. It was Paul who got the Round River to run straight and who dug the St. Lawrence River. And when the Yellowstone River got frozen to the Missouri River during the winter of the blue snow, who do you think unstuck them again? Paul also created the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. And here is how he did it. When logging was at its height, some important people hired Paul and his crew to dig a canal across the middle of the country so logs could float back and forth. So Paul started digging. Whistling as he worked, he shoveled so fast that before long he built up a great heap of dirt to the right and one to the left. And that's exactly how the Rockies came to be on one side of the United States and the Appalachians on the other. When Paul was finished digging the canal, Babe kicked in a huge bucket of water and turned Paul's canyon into the great Mississippi River. So as you can see, there wasn't much about the great outdoors that Paul wasn't involved with in one way or another. Now, you're probably wondering whatever happened to Paul Bunyan, the greatest lumberjack of all time. Well, there are plenty of stories about that too. But most folks claim that the United States was just getting too civilized for Paul and Babe. So the two headed north to Alaska, the only state truly big enough for the two of them. Others, mostly loggers, insist that Paul Bunyan is still around the lower 48. According to them, Paul's fame has made him want to retire as of late, and that he now spends his time relaxing deep in the northern woods. So remember, if you're ever out walking in the woods one day and you hear a loud voice holler, a timber, so loud it makes the entire forest shake. Don't be too startled if you turn and find yourself staring at the boot of Paul Bunyan, the greatest lumberjack of them all. Long ago, before highways, before cities, there was a family headed west. A covered wagon creaking across the open prairie, drawn by horses and hope. Inside that wagon rode a baby, quiet, wide-eyed, wrapped in a dusty blanket. His name? William. But no one called him that for long. You see, something mighty strange happened that day. As the family crossed the Pecos River, the wagon hit a rock, and the baby tumbled right out. Down he rolled, out of the back, bounced twice, and plopped softly onto the prairie grass. The wagon kept moving, and no one noticed, except the coyotes. Now, them coyotes, they took a liking to the boy. He didn't cry. He didn't whimper. He just looked up at them and smiled. So they raised him as one of their own, fed him snake milk, taught him to run like the wind, howl at the moon, and sleep with one eye open. They called him a Bill. And he grew up wild, fast, and strong, barefoot, bare-chested, and braver than a mountain lion in a thunderstorm. He could out-howl a whole pack of wolves. He could outrun a jackrabbit on hot sand. And by the time he was 12, he could wrestle a full-grown grizzly bear just for fun. The desert became his cradle, the sun his lantern, the wind his lullaby. And though he never knew it, that river where he'd fallen, the Pecos River, had given him his name. Bill grew up thinking he was a coyote, until one day he was chasing a jackrabbit, fast as a tumbleweed in a twister, when he stumbled upon something strange. A man, riding a horse, wearing boots and a hat. Bill stopped. The horse neighed. The man raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'll be," the cowbear said. "What in thunderation are you supposed to be?" Bill tilted his head, sniffed the air, then replied in a long, low howl. The cowbear laughed so hard he nearly fell off his saddle. "You're no coyote," he said. "You're a boy. A wild one, but a boy just the same." And that's when Bill realized something. He was different. From that moment, Bill followed the cowbear back to town. He walked into a saloon on all fours, sniffed the spittoon, howled at the piano, and nearly bit the barkeep. But folks didn't shoo him away. They were amazed. Some said he was a mountain spirit. Others thought he was raised by desert ghosts. But one old man in the corner just smiled and said, "He's a Texan, all right. A real one." From that day on, Pecos Bill became legend. He learned to ride horses, eat beans from a can, and wear boots with spurs, though he never stopped howling at the moon. But even among cowboys, Pecos Bill stood apart. He didn't need a lasso. He could rope a steer with a rattlesnake. He didn't need a gun. He could outstare a cougar. He didn't need a saddle. He rode wild mustangs bareback, whispering to them until they bowed their heads in respect. And when he rode across the prairie, the ground would rumble, clouds would scatter, and the sun itself would lean in to watch. Some say he built the Rio Grande just by dragging his heel through the sand. Others say he dug the Grand Canyon when he lost a spur and went searching for it. And many swear he invented the cowbird yodel, just to keep the coyotes company on lonely nights. But Bill never bragged. He never boasted. He just smiled that quiet, crooked smile, tipped his hat, and said, "Just doing what needs doing, friend." At night, Pecos Bill would lie under the stars, hat over his eyes, coyote pups curled at his feet. He'd hum a low, lonesome tune, one that sounded like the wind through mesquite trees, like the hush before a desert storm, like home. Because for Pecos Bill, home wasn't a cabin or a town. It was sky and sand, and the feeling of riding free, with no fences, no clocks, and nothing but time. One hot afternoon, while other cowboys were napping in the shade, Pecos Bill sat on a rocky ridge, watching the clouds gather on the horizon. They were heavy, swollen with thunder and dust, rolling across the plains like a herd of black bison. But Bill didn't flinch. He grinned. "Looks like it's time to ride," he said. Because Pecos Bill, he didn't ride horses like ordinary men. He rode tornadoes, while the townsfolk ran for cover. Bill tossed off his hat, tightened his belt, and ran straight toward the whirling funnel. He leapt into the air, grabbed hold of the storm's reins, and swung himself up through the clouds. From miles away, people swore they saw a man riding the eye of the storm, hat flapping, boots blazing, lightning dancing around his shoulders. Bill whooped and hollered, turned that tornado inside out, and steered it across Texas like a bucking bronco. He used it to sweep the dust off the plains, clear the cactus out of his way, and carve canyons deep into the desert floor. Then he slid down a sunbeam and landed soft as a feather in the middle of the Rio Grande. After that day, folks said Bill could charm the sky itself. If the wind ever got too wild, Bill would just whistle, and the storm would come curl at his boots like a house cat. But even a storm tamer can't stop the unexpected. One morning, Bill was riding across the desert when something strange caught his eye. It wasn't a rattler. It wasn't a coyote. And it wasn't a dust devil. It was her, riding across the plain on the back of a giant catfish. side saddle, smiling like she owned the horizon. Her name was Slewfoot Sue. Her skirt shimmered like river water. Her voice, like honey stirred with sassafras. And her boots had more personality than most saloons. Bill had faced mountain lions, twisters, and flash floods. But this was danger of a different kind. His heart thudded. His knees shook. And for the first time in his life, Pecos Bill forgot how to talk. He watched her ride past with a wink. And from that moment, he was done for. Sue wasn't impressed by all the tales. She didn't care that he tamed rattlesnakes or dug out the Rio Grande. She just looked at him and said, "You ain't like the others, are YA?" And Bill replied, "No'm, I'm Pecos Bill." They spent days riding the macers, nights under the stars, laughing, talking, swapping tall tales. Bill taught her how to lasso a cloud. Sue showed him how to ride a thunderfish. And when she dared him to rope the moon, he tried. Soon, Bill knew he had to ask the question. So one evening, under the open sky, with coyotes singing in the distance, he knelt in the dust and tipped back his hat. "Miss Slewfoot Sue," he said, "will you ride with me forever? Through storms and rivers, deserts and stars?" She smiled. Not the big kind, just the quiet, certain kind, and said, "Well, sure, cowbear, but only if I can ride your horse on our wedding day." And that's where the trouble started. Because Bill's horse wasn't just a horse. It was lightning. A horse so wild, he could outrun his own shadow. The day of the wedding dawned hot and wide. Bill polished his boots. Sue braided her hair. The coyotes held a wedding tune. And the sun stood still in the sky, just to watch. There was one small request. Sue wanted to ride Bill's horse. Lightning, the wildest stallion west of anywhere. Bill scratched his chin. Now, Lightning wasn't a horse you just sat on. He wasn't tamed. He was wind-wrapped in muscle. He snorted thunder. He poured sparks from the earth. But Sue, she wasn't afraid. "I can handle him," as she said with a wink. The wedding was beautiful. Bill wore his cleanest shirt. Sue wore a wide hoop dress, so full of ruffles it could have caught the breeze like a sail. They said their vows under the Texas sky, with armadillos as ring bearers, and jackrabbits lined up in rows. And then, it was time for the ride. Sue stepped up to Lightning. He snorted. She narrowed her eyes. "Now don't be difficult," as she whispered, and swung one leg over. The moment she landed in the saddle, Lightning bucked. He leapt 10 feet into the air, then kicked the clouds, then shot like a cannon straight up. Sue held on tight, laughing the whole way. But her big, bouncy skirt? That was trouble. It caught the wind like a balloon, lifting her higher and higher. Up she went, past the mesquite trees, past the vultures, past the moon, until she was just a tiny ribbon spinning in the sky. Now, Bill loved that woman, and he wasn't about to let her float away. So he grabbed his longest lasso, 100 feet of rattlesnake skin, cured and stretched, and spun it into the sky. He aimed true, but before the rope could catch her, Sue hit the ground and bounced straight up again, even higher this time, like a giant rubber ball with lipstick and boots. Bill tried to catch her on the second bounce, then the third, then the fifth, but Sue kept going, up and down, like a prairie comet. They say she never touched ground again, that she kept bouncing clear into the sky. Some folks say she landed on the moon, where she still sits today, sipping starlight and waving to coyotes. Others say she became a constellation, and that's why the night has a sparkle in its smile. As for Bill, he never loved again. They say he went back to the desert, rode lightning far beyond the maps, to the edge of the sky, where dust turns to clouds, and cowboys ride forever. Some say he built himself a little cabin on a cliff where the stars touch the earth, and when the wind howls just right, you can still hear his boots, soft on stone, walking toward a memory. Some stories never end. They just ride on. And so, if you're ever in Texas, on a still night, with the moon hanging low and proud, look up. If you see a glimmer, spinning high in the sky, that's just Slewfoot Sue, still bouncing with joy. And if you hear a low whistle, like a tune on the wind, that's Pecos Bill, smiling beneath his hat, watching the stars, waiting for her to come down. They say he was born with a hammer in his hand. Not just any hammer, but one of iron and song. One that rang like thunder and struck like a heartbeat. John Henry came into the world on a stormy night, when clouds rolled like mountains across the sky, and rain fell like nails from heaven. His mother held him close and whispered, "This boy ain't ordinary." And she was right. By the time he could walk, he could lift a sack of corn like it was a feather. By the time he was 10, he could swing an axe and split a log in one blow. And by the time he was grown, well, there wasn't a man alive who could match him for strength or soul or song. John Henry didn't chase glory. He didn't need to. He was quiet, solid as stone. He worked hard, spoke soft, and when he sang, the hills would listen. He sang while he worked, swinging his hammer down on steel spikes, driving them deep into the railroad ties. One strike, two strikes, sharp and steady, like a drumbeat in the chest of the earth. The other men would stop just to hear him, and even the wind seemed to slow down, to carry his song a little farther. The railroad was coming. It stretched across the land, like a long silver ribbon, tied tight to the dreams of a growing nation. Mountains stood in its path, stone and shadow, old as time. But John Henry and the railroad crew, they met those mountains with iron in hand, with hammers, with sweat, with rhythm. Each day they carved tunnels through rock. Each night they slept beneath the stars. Their hands blistered, their bones aching. But John, he just kept swinging. One strike, two strikes. Boom, boom. His hammer rang like freedom, like a promise, like a story yet to be finished. Now, folks started to talk. "He's the strongest man I've ever seen," one worker said. "He don't take no rest, don't take no water." Another added, "He just keeps going." Even the railroad bosses took notice. They'd never seen a man like John Henry. "He's like a machine," they said. But machines were just beginning to rise. One morning, a big company man rode into camp in a fancy suit and shiny boots. Behind him, on a flat-bed rail cow, stood something tall and strange. A machine, black as coal, loud as thunder, with gears and pipes hissing steam. "This here's a steam drill," the man said. "It'll drive through mountain rock faster than any man." The workers looked on in silence. The machine puffed and groaned. Its metal parts gleamed in the sunlight. And then, the company man smiled. "No more need for hammers," he said. "No more need for men. But John Henry stepped forward. He looked the machine up and down. Then he looked at his hammer. Smooth, worn, familiar. He said nothing. Not yet. But inside him, something old and deep began to stir. That night, by the fire, John Henry sat quietly. The men around him murmured. Were they really going to be replaced? Could gears and steam take the place of hands and heart? John stared into the flames. He knew the answer. And by morning, he'd made his decision. He stood tall and calm, his hammer slung across his back. And he spoke just once. I'll race that steam drill. Man against machine. The morning broke slow and heavy. A hush rolled through the camp. Even the wind held its breath. John Henry stepped forward, his hammer across his shoulder, his eyes steady as stone. The company man stood beside the machine, grinning like he'd already won. She's the finest steam drill ever made, he said. Built by engineers, fueled by coal, stronger than 100 men. John didn't blink. He simply asked, "Where's the mountain?" They led him to a thick wall of rock, tough and jagged, unbroken by rail. The steam drill stood on one side, John Henry on the other. Crowds gathered. Workers, foremen, children who had never seen a man challenge a machine. The sun rose high. The air buzzed with silence. And then, with one deep breath, John Henry raised his hammer. Boom! Down it came. A perfect strike. Boom! Again. Each blow rang out like a bell. The steam drill hissed, chugged, groaned to life, and began pounding into the stone. But John Henry was already moving. Strike after strike. 1, 2. 1, 2. The sound echoed down the valley, like a song made of thunder. His shirt clung to his back. His muscles burned. But his hands never stopped. Each swing came clean and sharp. No wasted motion. No wasted breath. The crowd leaned in, eyes wide, hearts racing. The steam drill puffed and spat sparks. Metal shrieked against stone. But it didn't sing like John's hammer did. His hammer had rhythm, soul, memory. With each blow, it whispered, I am here. I am real. I will not be replaced. Hours passed. Dust filled the air. The mountain shuddered. And still he swung. No break. No pause. The sun crossed the sky. And John Henry carved deeper and deeper. The tunnel wrapping around him, like the arms of something ancient. The company man wiped his brow. His machine rattled and spat smoke. Gears began to strain. Pistons slowed. And then, with a final grinding whine, the steam drill stopped. Too hot. Too tired. Too much. But John Henry? He swung once more. And then again. And one last time. A mighty, thunderous blow that split the stone like it was made of clay. Then silence. For just a breath. The crowd rushed in. They saw two tunnels. Side by side. The steam drills bore. Crooked and shallow. And John Henry's. Smooth, clean, deep as honor itself. He had won. Cheers rose. Voices rang out. Some wept. John Henry smiled. Slow and quiet. He stepped forward, hammer still in hand. But then he staggered. The mountain had taken its toll. Each strike had carved through more than just stone. His heart, that mighty drum inside him, had given all it had. He sank to his knees, then to the earth, and his hammer rolled from his hand. The crowd grew still. Someone knelt beside him. John Henry looked up at the sky, wide, blue, and endless, and whispered something no one could quite hear. A name, a memory, or maybe just a song. And then he was still. They buried him by the tracks. Beside the tunnel he carved with his own two hands. No fancy words. No polished stone. Just a marker made of iron. And the sound of trains passing slow and soft, as if to honor the silence. The workers laid down their tools. Some wept. Some sang. But all of them stood still, as the wind carried the rhythm of his hammer one last time. The railroad moved on. More machines came. More tunnels. More steam. But no one ever forgot that day. They told their children, who told theirs, of the man who beat the machine, not out of pride, but out of love, for work, for dignity, for people who used their hands to shape the world. And some say, if you stand by a tunnel near sunset, when the light turns golden, and the shadows stretch long across the hills, if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can still hear it. Clang, clang, the steady beat of iron on stone. Not loud, not fast, but true. They say his hammer was never found, that it sank into the earth and grew roots like a tree, that each time someone swings a tool in honest work, a little of John Henry's spirit swings with them. And the train, it still runs through that tunnel every day. But as it passes, Engineers tip their caps. Passengers fall quiet. And the wheels seem to slow, just for a moment, as if the train remembers who carved its way forward. Some say John Henry became the wind, moving through the hills, keeping pace with the trains, watching over those who build and dig and sweat. Others say he walks beside every worker, not to help carry the weight, but just to remind them they matter. Because John Henry wasn't just strong. He was human. And he showed the world that heart, real heart, is worth more than steam and gears and gold. So rest easy now, dear listener. Let the rhythm fade, soft and slow. The hammer sleeps, but the story lives. And if you ever hear a train in the distance, listen closely and smile. That's John Henry saying good night.